Amara still remembered the first time she met Chike. It was at her cousin's wedding reception in Enugu. The hall was full of laughter, music, and clinking glasses. Amara had gone only because her mother insisted. She wasn't the type who enjoyed big gatherings. She preferred her books, her quiet routines, and her simple dreams. But that evening, as she tried to slip out of the hall to catch some fresh air, a man intercepted her path with a smile that seemed rehearsed. Chike. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his wealth like a second skin. His suit was tailored, his wristwatch gleamed under the lights, and his cologne carried a sharp, commanding scent. Everyone seemed to know him. Men shook his hand, women leaned closer when he spoke, and yet he focused only on her. "You don't look like you want to be here," he said, tilting his head, studying her like she was a puzzle. "I don't," Amara replied honestly. He laughed, the kind of laugh that made others glance their way. Then, without asking, he ordered drinks for both of them and began talking. Amara wasn't impressed at first. She had heard about him even before they met. Chike, the young businessman who had inherited his father's transport company and turned it into a giant. Chike, the man whose money and good looks kept him in the gossip columns. Chike, who had a reputation for moving from one woman to the next like changing clothes. She told herself she wanted nothing to do with him. But Chike was persistent. He sent flowers to her workplace. He appeared outside her church after Sunday service. He called her every morning, every night. When Amara's father fell sick and the hospital bills mounted, Chike stepped in and paid them quietly. Everyone around her whispered the same thing. "This is fate. Don't fight it. A man like him choosing you? That's a blessing." Eventually, Amara gave in, not because she was swept off her feet, but because his consistency wore her down. It was hard to say no to someone who never seemed to stop showing up. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that drew half the town. Guests praised their union. Amara's parents cried tears of joy, relieved that their daughter had found such a powerful protector. And at first, life seemed like a dream. Chike bought her a house in the city, filled with everything she could ever want. He took her on trips abroad. He told her she would never have to worry about money again. When their first child was born, a boy they named Somto, Chike cried openly in the hospital ward, holding the baby close. A year later, their daughter Ada followed, completing what seemed like the perfect family portrait. But Amara began to notice cracks in the mask. It started with small things. The way he snapped at her for speaking when he was watching TV, the way he dismissed her opinions in front of his friends, the way his temper flashed when things didn't go his way. Then it grew worse. One night, when Somto was barely 2, Chike returned home drunk. Amara asked him why he was so late. He slapped her across the face before walking into the bedroom like nothing had happened. The next morning he bought her jewellery and kissed her on the forehead as though the night before had been a dream. That was how it began. The cycle of violence and apology. The shouting, the threats, the bruises hidden under long sleeves, followed by gifts, promises and soft words. Amara learned to stay quiet, to endure, to keep peace for the sake of her children. But in her heart, something was changing. Chike's true nature revealed itself fully after their 4th year of marriage. By then his wealth had multiplied. He owned filling stations, hotels, transport lines, and plots of land scattered across Enugu, Asaba, and Lagos. He was respected in business circles, feared by competitors, and admired by many who envied his power. And yet inside his own home, he was a tyrant. He cheated without shame. Sometimes he disappeared for nights. Sometimes he brought women into their home when Amara was away with the children. He didn't even bother to hide it anymore. When Amara confronted him, his response was always the same. "Do you want to leave? Go ahead. But you'll leave without the children, without a kobo. Who will believe you? Who will fight me? Nobody." He believed his money and name made him untouchable, and to some extent he was right. Amara's parents begged her to stay. Her friends told her to endure for the children. Society reminded her that leaving a man like Chike would bring shame, so she stayed. But each day she grew colder inside. The children became her only source of joy. Somto, with his endless questions and his dream of becoming a pilot. Ada, with her laughter that could fill the whole house. Amara told herself she had to survive, if only for them. Meanwhile, Chike's arrogance grew. He entertained women openly at hotels, sometimes in the same city where he knew people would recognize him. He made no effort to cover his tracks. His phone buzzed at night with messages he didn't bother to hide. One evening, as Amara served him dinner, his phone lit up with a picture of a woman in a red dress. He didn't flinch. He just laughed, showed the message to Amara and said, "You see? This is what women still do for me, even when they know I'm married. You should be grateful I kept you in this house. Do you know how many women want your position?" Amara stared at him silently, her heart like stone. That night, as he slept heavily beside her, she turned her face to the ceiling and thought, "This man believes he cannot be touched. But even giants fall." She didn't know yet how or when, but a seed had been planted. The thought of leaving had died long ago. Now another thought began to grow in its place. Not leaving, not running, but taking back her life. Slowly, silently, and completely. The night that changed everything began like many others. Chike had been out drinking with his friends. Amara could tell by the way he staggered into the living room that he had mixed alcohol with something stronger. His words were slurred, his eyes bloodshot. The children had already gone to bed, though Somto had woken briefly when the door slammed. Amara had tucked him back in, whispering that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. She waited in the sitting room, tense, hoping Chike would go straight to sleep. But that night, he didn't. He accused her of nagging, of not being beautiful enough anymore, of failing him as a wife. He listed his mistresses one by one, comparing them to her, laughing at how much more exciting they were. When Amara tried to walk away, he grabbed her arm so tightly she felt her bones grind together. The argument escalated, his voice rising, until his rage tipped into violence. By the time he stormed off to bed, Amara was left on the floor, her body aching, her lip bleeding. But for the first time she didn't cry. She sat there, staring at the tiles, her breath shallow, her thoughts sharp and clear. Something inside her had snapped. She realized in that moment that she could not keep living like this, not for another year, not even for another day. She thought of her children, of the kind of man Somto might grow up to be if he thought this was normal. She thought of Ada, who might one day accept cruelty as love if she watched her mother endure it. And then the thought came, quiet and steady. If I cannot leave him, then he must leave me. Permanently. It was a terrifying thought, one she had never allowed herself to imagine, but once it entered her mind, it didn't leave. That night, she lay awake, staring at Chike as he snored beside her. She studied him the way one studies a dangerous animal, knowing its weaknesses, knowing how to survive. By morning, she had made her decision, not to confront him, not to run, but to plan. Carefully, patiently, quietly. She would not let rage guide her. She would not make mistakes. She would play the long game. Amara began by watching. She studied Chike's routines, what he ate, what he drank, how often he took his medicine for blood pressure. She noted the times he was distracted, the moments when his guard was down. She knew she could not strike fast. A sudden death would raise suspicion, but a slow decline, disguised as illness, would be unquestioned, especially with his lifestyle, alcohol, smoking, late nights, women. Everyone would assume he had brought it upon himself. Amara started with research. She spent hours on her phone, reading medical articles, scanning forums late into the night. She learned about substances that, in small doses, mimicked natural illnesses, weakness, stomach pain, fatigue. Nothing dramatic, just enough to seem like stress. The first time she slipped something into his drink, her hands trembled so badly she nearly spilled it. It was a Sunday afternoon. Chike was watching football with a bottle of beer in hand. Amara brought him another, smiling as though nothing was wrong. He barely looked at her as he took it. Her heart raced with every sip he swallowed. She waited, expecting some immediate reaction. But there was none. He simply burped, shouted at the TV, and carried on. That night he complained of mild stomach cramps. He blamed the pepper soup he had eaten at the bar earlier. Amara said nothing. Over the next weeks she continued. Never too much, never too obvious. A pinch here, a drop there. Always careful. Chike began to change. He grew tired more often, sweating at night, complaining of headaches. He started visiting doctors who told him it was stress and advised him to rest. Amara played the concerned wife perfectly. She accompanied him to appointments, made his meals with extra care, adjusted his pillows at night. She held his hand in public, earning the admiration of neighbours who whispered about her loyalty. Chike, blinded by arrogance, suspected nothing. In fact, her show of devotion made him trust her more. He began to rely on her for paperwork he once ignored. He signed whatever she placed in front of him, too tired to argue. That was when Amara saw the second part of her plan clearly. It wasn't enough for him to die. She needed to secure everything, every property, every business, every account. Not for herself alone, but for the children, for the life they deserved, free from his shadow. And so, while she poisoned him slowly, she also began to gather documents. Title deeds, account forms, company shares. She slipped them into folders, marking them neatly. Whenever he was too weak to read, she presented them. This one is just routine for the children's future, she would say. He barely glanced at them before signing. Each signature was a step closer to her freedom. Amara knew she had entered dangerous territory. One mistake could ruin everything. But the thought of stopping never crossed her mind. Every night as she watched him cough, sweat and groan in his sleep, she whispered silently in her heart, "This is justice. This is survival. This is the price for every bruise, every insult, every betrayal." And with each passing day, the mask of the helpless wife slipped away. Amara was no longer a victim. She was becoming something else entirely. Chike's health continued to decline. At first it was small things. Complaints of fatigue, a persistent cough, constant headaches. He brushed it off as stress, saying it was the price of being a powerful man. But as weeks turned into months, the symptoms grew harder to ignore. He began to lose weight. His once booming voice weakened. At meetings, he struggled to keep his focus, sometimes cutting discussions short to lie down. The same men who once admired him began whispering behind his back. "He doesn't look well. Maybe he's been cursed." All that drinking, all those women, it was only a matter of time. Amara listened to the gossip but never repeated it. Instead, she played the role of the doting wife. She accompanied Chike to doctors, carried his files, reminded him to take his medicine. And when he was too exhausted to handle paperwork, she stepped in. It began innocently. A bank form here, a contract there. Chike would grunt and wave his hand, saying, "Handle it, Amara. You know what's best." But she didn't just handle it. She rewrote the future. Bit by bit, she transferred property deeds into her name. She moved shares into accounts controlled solely by her. She adjusted company documents so that her signature carried weight equal to, and eventually greater than, his. Chike never noticed. He was too tired, too distracted, too arrogant to imagine she was capable of such careful calculation. Sometimes he asked what the papers were. "For the children's education," she would say softly. "For estate planning, just in case something happens. For tax reasons, nothing important." And he signed. Every stroke of his pen was a gift he didn't realize he was giving. Soon, almost everything of value, the hotels, the transport lines, the lands, belonged to Amara. She didn't rush. She kept her pace slow and steady, careful never to raise suspicion. In public, she remained the loyal wife. In private, she was building her own kingdom. By the time Chike's businesses began faltering because of his absence at key meetings, Amara was already untouchable. Even if he recovered, he would find himself weakened not only in body but in power. She knew he would never recover fully. That was the beauty of her plan. The poison was doing its work, and so was she. Through it all, Amara never forgot why she was doing this. Somto and Ada were her light in the darkness. They were still young. Somto was 9, Ada only 7, but already they were noticing things. The arguments, the silences, the way their father's voice shook the walls when he was angry. One evening, after Chike had shouted at her for misplacing a document he himself had lost, Amara found Ada crying quietly in her room. "Why is Daddy always angry?" Ada whispered. Amara pulled her close, holding her so tightly she could feel the child's heartbeat against her own. "Because Daddy doesn't know how to be happy," she said gently. "But that's not your fault. It's not mine either." She wiped Ada's tears and promised her that things would get better. With Somto, the questions were sharper. He was old enough to sense the tension, old enough to see the bruises she sometimes tried to hide. One day he asked bluntly, "Mummy, why don't you leave him?" Amara froze. She wanted to tell him the truth, that leaving was not an option, not with Chike's threats, not with the weight of society pressing down on her. But she also didn't want her son to grow up believing a man's power could trap a woman forever. So she bent down, looked him in the eye and said, "I will do what I must to protect you and Ada. One day, you will understand." Somto didn't push further, but his gaze lingered on her, filled with a kind of quiet wisdom no child should have to carry. At night, when the children slept, Amara would sit by their beds and whisper prayers. She asked God for strength, for patience, for courage. She told herself that every step she took against Chike was not for revenge alone. It was for these two innocent souls who deserved a better future. When she watched them play in the compound, chasing each other with laughter, her resolve hardened. They would not grow up broken. They would not repeat this cycle. Chike had stolen years of her peace, but he would not steal their future. And so, while she poisoned him slowly, while she collected his empire into her hands, she also poured love and gentleness into her children. She became both mother and father to them, protector and guide, and in her heart she knew, when this is all over, they will thank me. They will never know the full truth, but they will live the life I fought for them to have. By the end of the 2nd year of his illness, Chike was only a shadow of the man he had once been. The man who once walked into a room with power dripping from every gesture now moved slowly, his shoulders hunched, his steps uncertain. His clothes hung loose on him. His once booming laugh had thinned into a cough that shook his frame. Business partners began to notice. He missed meetings, sometimes sending Amara in his place. At first they tolerated it. After all, sickness can strike anyone. But as months passed and his presence grew rarer, whispers started spreading. Maybe he isn't capable of leading anymore. His wife seems to be handling things better than he does. Should we start pulling our investments? Amara fed those whispers carefully. When she attended meetings, she was composed, confident, calm. She handled figures with precision, spoke with authority, and carried herself like someone who had been preparing all her life for this role. The board members began looking at her differently, not as Chike's wife, but as a leader in her own right. And Chike, too weak to see what was happening, still believed he was in control. He thought he was only temporarily handing things over until his strength returned, but his strength never returned. At home, his frustration turned into bitterness. He shouted more, cursed more, struck Amara when his anger spilled over. Yet even in his rage, he grew careless. His blows no longer carried the weight they once had. Sometimes, in the middle of his tirades, his body betrayed him. He would cough so violently that he had to sit down, clutching his chest. Amara always rushed to his side, playing the dutiful wife. She would fetch water, rub his back, whisper that he needed rest. He never suspected the truth. The mistresses, once countless, began to vanish. At first they drifted away quietly, uncomfortable with his weakening health. Later, when his money grew harder to access and his charm disappeared, they fled entirely. One by one, the women who had once fought for his attention stopped answering his calls, and the same friends who had filled his nights with drink and laughter stopped visiting. Chike, once surrounded by people, now sat alone most evenings. His only company, the wife he still believed was loyal. He didn't see that his kingdom was collapsing piece by piece. But Amara saw. She watched every brick fall, every pillar crumble, and she felt no pity. This was justice. The night Amara gave him the final dose was quiet. The children were asleep, their soft breaths filling the silence of the house. The city outside buzzed faintly, but inside, time seemed to slow. Chike was sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at a half-finished plate of food. He had grown so thin that his cheekbones jutted sharply, his skin dull and lifeless. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he muttered, almost to himself. "Doctors can't find anything. Maybe someone cursed me. Maybe it's all these enemies in business." Amara placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her face a mask of concern. "You'll be fine," she said softly. "Just eat, take your medicine and rest." He nodded, too weary to argue. She went into the kitchen, her movements steady, her heart strangely calm. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Tonight, it would end. She prepared his tea, ginger and honey, the way he liked it. Into it, she slipped the final dose, strong enough to finish what the years of careful poisoning had begun. When she returned, she set the cup before him and watched. Chike sipped slowly, grimacing at the heat. Then he sighed, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder," he said hoarsely, "if you regret marrying me." Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "No," she whispered. "I don't regret anything." It was the truth. She didn't regret the path that had brought her here, because every step had led to this freedom. Minutes passed. Chike's breathing grew uneven. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Amara remained by his side, her face calm, her eyes unblinking. When he finally collapsed forward onto the table, his body twitching before going still, she reached out and closed his eyes with her hand. There was no fear, no panic, only silence, heavy and final. For years she had lived in his shadow. For years she had endured pain, humiliation and betrayal, but now the shadow was gone. She sat there for a long time, watching the stillness settle over him. Then she rose, adjusted her wrapper, and walked to the children's room. She stood in the doorway, watching Somto and Ada sleep peacefully. In that moment, she knew she had done what she must. The man who had poisoned her life was gone, and with his death, her children's future had been restored. When the news of Chike's death spread, the city erupted in whispers. Some said it was sudden, others said it was long expected. Everyone agreed he had been unwell for years. Neighbours came by the house, bringing food and condolences. Friends who had abandoned him in his last months returned, their faces painted with sympathy. "He was such a strong man," they said. "He built so much in his lifetime. Amara, you were such a faithful wife." Amara received their words with bowed head and quiet tears. She let them believe she was the grieving widow. She wore black. She sat in silence during the endless visits, nodding softly as people praised her strength. Nobody suspected. At the funeral, the turnout was grand. The hall was filled with men in suits, women in fine lace, clergymen who spoke of Chike's generosity. The choir sang hymns that echoed through the walls. Amara sat at the front with Somto and Ada beside her, their small hands clinging to hers. She didn't shed a single real tear. but her face remained composed, her performance flawless. People saw what they wanted to see, a woman devastated by loss, holding her children together with quiet dignity. The burial was even more elaborate. An expensive casket, a sprawling ceremony on family land, speeches, prayers, and long tributes. But when it was all over, when the crowd had dispersed, when the last handful of sand had been thrown on the coffin, Amara felt nothing but release. For the first time in over a decade, she could breathe. Life after Chike was quiet but not empty. Amara moved carefully, settling into her role as the sole head of the family. The businesses were already in her name, the accounts under her control. The house belonged to her. The cars, the lands, the shares, everything had been secured long before his final breath. But she didn't flaunt it. She didn't throw parties or buy new jewellery. She kept her life modest, deliberate, focused on the children. People praised her for her humility. She's not like other widows who rush to enjoy wealth. She's wise. She's raising her children with dignity. She was truly the right woman for him. Every compliment was another shield. The more they admired her, the less they questioned her. Somto and Ada adjusted slowly. At night they sometimes asked where Daddy had gone. Amara told them the truth, but gently. He was sick for a long time. Now he's resting. She never spoke of the bruises, the violence, the betrayal. She wanted them to remember only what would not scar them. But deep inside she promised herself that neither child would grow up to repeat Chike's mistakes. Somto would learn respect, kindness, patience. Ada would learn strength, independence, courage. Chike's blood ran in them, but his shadow would not. And so in the weeks that followed, Amara built a new life. Quiet, steady, hers alone. Years later, Amara sometimes sat by the window at dusk, watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. The children, now teenagers, laughed in the yard, their voices carrying into the house. And in those quiet moments, her thoughts wandered back. She thought of the girl she had once been, the shy young woman who had met Chike at a wedding, the woman who had believed persistence was love, who had believed wealth meant security. She thought of the years of silence, of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of nights spent whispering prayers in the dark. She thought of the day she had made her choice, the night she had prepared that first poisoned drink, her hands trembling with fear. The years she had spent carrying out her plan with the patience of a hunter. She thought of his final breath, the way the world had mourned him, never knowing the truth. And she asked herself, was it wrong? Was it justice? Was it survival? Her heart always gave the same answer. It was survival. If she had done nothing, she would still be trapped in his cage. Her children would still be growing up in fear, learning that love meant pain, that marriage meant submission. By ending him, she had ended the cycle. Now Somto was growing into a kind young man, protective of his sister, respectful of his mother. Ada was bold and curious, unafraid to ask questions, unafraid to dream big. They were free, and so was she. Amara didn't see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a mother who had fought with the only weapon she had. And in the stillness of those evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the children's laughter echoed in the yard, she felt no regret, only peace. For the first time in her life, peace.
For more interesting stories, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe.